So, welcome friends to the first of our new Homegroup series on the fruits of the Spirit. And if you were in church on Sunday just gone, or if you were watching the service online, you will have picked up the sermon that I preached on 1 Corinthians 13. So Paul, having kicked us off last Sunday thinking about Galatians 5, we then moved on to thinking in a bit of detail about the very first of the fruits that are listed in Galatians 5. And we thought about 1 Corinthians 13 and that long, extended, wonderful reflection that Paul provides us on agape love. You might remember that one of the things that I mentioned was how 1 Corinthians 13 is probably a text that we hear most often read out at weddings, and we've got a picture of the couple and they're standing and they're gazing at one another, and here is this reminder of values of the type of love which is only going to be the basis of them building a life and sticking together and building a home. And of course it has lots of obvious applications and meaning on an occasion like that. But as we were saying on Sunday, this is not actually the original sort of context that 1 Corinthians 13 is addressing. This is a chapter that comes right at the end of a letter that Paul is addressing to possibly the most dysfunctional of the churches that he writes to. There are all sorts of issues going on. You read early in the letter about factions. Do you remember? Some are saying, I follow Paul. Some are saying, I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or whatever. We've got issues over sexual immorality in the church. There's all of the inappropriate behaviour around communion. You've got some people bringing tons of food. You've got some people at the love feasts who don't have enough food. And then chapters 12 through to 14, Paul writes about worship. There are clearly issues about this church's worship life which are problematic as well. There are the use of gifts, the use of tongues, prophecies, and so on, which clearly seem to be exercised in a way which is causing division, and perhaps it would seem a way of some people sort of gathering status for themselves and sort of building themselves or puffing themselves up on the basis of these gifts. And it's right in the middle of these sections on worship that Paul writes. And he writes about love. You might remember as well, he uses a very specific word to talk about love. So it's not eros, which was the Greek word for romantic love. It's not philia, which was the Greek word for friendship. He writes about agape, which was not a word Christians invented. It was a sort of older Greek word that described a kind of self-giving love. And it was that word that the Christians kind of latched onto or appropriated to speak of the love that was Christ-like love. It's love which is very marked out by care for the other person. Paul starts by talking about the importance of this love. Famously he says, to remember, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels but don't have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Perhaps he's got in his mind the sort of cymbals or instruments that would have been used in the sort of feverish, frenetic worship that went on in pagan temples. And if that is the case, well, my goodness, that's quite a rebuke to the people who think that their form of Christian worship is so much better than anyone else. Is Paul almost saying, you don't have love, you might as well be down with the pagans, clanging their cymbals like they do. Then we move on into the middle section where Paul offers those very famous words about what love actually looks like in practice, how it's lived out, what love is and what love isn't. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in our study this evening. And then there's a final section of this chapter. It's a reminder which Paul provides about how love will last, how God's love, which has called us and saved us and which transforms us, is going to last far into the future. It will still be around in the new world he is making. There are some things, like tongues, like words of knowledge. They're actually just temporary arrangements. The things that God gives us, maybe to help us connect with Him and know Him in worship, but only for this current time when we see through a mirror darkly. It's these things that the Corinthians are focusing on. They're allowing them to become the source of their division, but they're not things of long-term importance. And what Paul says is of ultimate long-term importance is love. Focus on love. So this might seem like a strange question to ask, but actually I think it gets to the heart of some of the problems which are going on in the church in Corinth, problems which Paul wants to address. Remember again the context. This is a church which is tearing itself apart over a number of topics. In chapters 12 to 14, the presenting issue is all to do with worship. There are clearly these people who are seeking this status based on possessing what have come to be seen as the most prestigious spiritual gift to possess. And I think that part of what Paul is trying to say to the church here is, if you really had a perspective which was shaped by love, you wouldn't be thinking this way. So here's a question for us to reflect on in SBC. We have our problems. There are things that we disagree about. Maybe we just need to take some time to name some of those issues and then to ask ourselves, have we lost our sense of perspective here? If we had a perspective that said, love matters more than these things which divide us, how would church be different? So maybe you might want to take some time to reflect on that now. Why don't you hit the pause button, have a conversation about this, and we'll see you again in a couple of minutes with another question to ponder on. So sometimes when you listen to a reading in a different translation, it brings a freshness, it brings a life, a vitality to the passage that we might not have experienced in a while, because we've just become overly familiar, I guess, with one particular translation. So I want us to listen now to 1 Corinthians 13 and verses 4 to 7, and the way that they are translated by Eugene Peterson in the Message. I think this is a brilliant translation. I think when you go back and you look at some of the Greek words and the meaning that was lying behind them, I think he brings them out really well. So why don't you listen to this reading? Just ask yourself, are there any words or phrases which stand out and which make you think differently about the call to love that we find in this passage? Love never gives up. Love cares for others, more for others than for self. Love doesn't want what it doesn't have. Love doesn't strut, doesn't have a swelled head. Love doesn't force itself on others, isn't always me first, doesn't fly off the handle, doesn't keep score of the sins of others, doesn't revel when others grovel, takes pleasure in the flowering of truth, puts up with anything, trusts God always looks for the best, never looks back, but keeps going to the end. Be interesting for you to reflect on those words together, but before you do, here's Denzel with a couple of his thoughts on that translation.
Yeah, thank you for that, Trevor. I think it's quite interesting. Normally I'm an ESV person, so I'm always reading from the ESV, but reading it in a Message translation was quite powerful. And I think for me, you can kind of see Eugene Peterson and this translation. It's almost making love as a person who's walking and breathing, and it kind of puts flesh to what it actually looks like practically to walk in love. And so one of the things I did last night when I was reading this particular translation, which really convicted me, because I think all of the words really stand out, but I kind of changed it a bit and put my name in that love, to see myself as this person, or to see our church as this living, breathing application of what 1 Corinthians 13 looks like. So for me, it was, if you want to put your name in it, for me it was basically saying from verse 4, Denzel never gives up. Denzel doesn't care more for others than himself. Denzel cares more for others than himself. Denzel doesn't want what he doesn't have. Denzel doesn't thrust. Denzel doesn't have a swelled head. Denzel doesn't force himself on others, isn't always me first. Denzel doesn't fly off the handle. Denzel doesn't keep scores of sins of others, and so on, going through this passage. And I think reading that really convicted me, because that's not always the case in my life. But I think reading this translation kind of puts it more, put more flesh into it, to see love as this person who is living, breathing, and living this out. So maybe you want to put your name in that, and hopefully be convicted by reading your name in this passage and seeing it become a reality in our lives. So that's my reflection.
And so now we come to the third and final question in our conversation this evening. What am I investing in? And what do I mean by that? Well, I guess in asking this, I'm encouraging us to think about that final section of 1 Corinthians 13. We spoke about it on Sunday, where Paul is asking the Corinthians to take a longer term view. Here they are getting preoccupied with issues like tongues and prophecies, things which are going to fade away into insignificance one day, when God's purposes for the world are complete and we are face to face in his presence. And so Paul says, focus on love, focus on developing a loving heart and personality. And with this in mind, we might want to consider, are the things we focused on, are the things we've made a big deal, but actually we just need to put them aside and have this bigger, longer term perspective and get on with the business of being more loving. And if we did that, how would that change us? So again, one more time, you might just want to hit that pause button, have a little bit of a chat about your response to this question. What am I investing in? And then we'll come back in a few moments' time and we'll pray together. Well, friends, we hope you found your time of conversation helpful this evening. To finish with, here's a prayer by Gerard Kelly, the poet and preacher. And I hope that it's one which helps you pray for each other, as I hope that you'll do in a moment, about the things we've been talking about, and maybe the other struggles, other concerns that you will be working through with your brothers and sisters in Homegroup this week. And this poem is called Love Me into Love. Love me into loving Jesus. Grow me into grace. Set me up for servitude. Forge forgiveness in me. Pour me out in passion. Mould me into mercy. Caress me into caring. Recreate me to the core. As your worship to the Father, as your love gift to the world, as your act of crafted kindness, as the music of your soul. Break the seals, tip the bottles, squeeze the perfume out, turn me towards tenderness. Love me into love. Amen.